first introduction into the film industry actually happened, I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. And that's back in the day when they were making a lot of films here. And a friend of mine said, and I was 14 years old, a friend of mine said, hey, they're doing a film up in the Catalanotte Mountains. How would you like to go up and visit and just, check it out? I said, sure. So we went up there, without an invitation. We just walked on set. And anyway, I'm walking around and I noticed this one actor, and I go up and I said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm acting in this movie. And I said, oh, really? And he says, who are you? And I said, well, I'm Mark Headley. I, live here. And he took me around and introduced me to the actors, to the director. And, I said, what's your name, sir? And he said, Sidney Poitier. Got the Academy Awards for Lilies of the Field, or shot here in Tucson. So that, being on set that whole day just really inspired me. I did a lot of visiting old Tucson, back in the day, and it was always busy, I got to know Bob Shelton very well. And, Bob Shelton and I formed the first Tucson Film Commission, back in the 60s, early 70s. And then I had a film arts group, and we did, a lot of experimental films, but we also got, visited sets. And there were a number of people that came to Tucson to make movies. And then I got hired as a extra and an actor in some of the films that were shot here. So I got to work with John Wayne, Lee Marvin, Jack Palance, Elizabeth Taylor, and as a matter of fact, I met Marilyn Monroe. She was visiting the set of one of the actors. Sidney Poitier was, I kept in touch with him, and in my early 20s, when I was on the Tucson Film Commission working with Bob Shelton and Marilyn Murphy here, we found out that Sidney Poitier was going to be directing a feature film. So I called up Sidney, went out to Hollywood, and the city of Tucson paid for my trip over. I took Sidney Poitier to lunch and said, well, what movie are you doing? And he said, Stir Crazy. And I said, well, where are you going to be shooting this? And he said, well, we haven't decided yet. I said, well, you like Tucson, right? He said, I love Tucson. I said, come on out, let's take you around and let's introduce you to Tucson, reintroduce you to Tucson. And the rest is history. He did Stir Crazy there. When I worked with John Huston, who directed so many major pictures, but he did Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean here in Tucson. And I was an extra in the movie. And I wanted to be an actor, I thought, when I grew up. And I was following Paul Newman around, as Judge Roy Bean. And it was really fascinating. So I'd go up to him and, ask him questions and talk to him. And then the extras, Frank Kennedy, who hired, the extras and hired me, would always come up and say, stop bugging the actors, So anyway, I kind of snuck up to Paul Newman one time and I said, who's that old gray-haired gentleman over there? Before you do a scene, he tells you what to do and stuff. He says, oh, well, let me introduce you. So I walk over and, John Huston is on the phone, who's talking evidently to the studio because he's screaming at him saying, it's only $800,000 budget and we need more money out here. And so anyway, Paul Newman taps him on the shoulder. John Huston hangs the phone up, turns around and says, yeah, yes, Paul? And he says, John, I'd like to introduce you to one of your actors. He didn't call me an extra, call me an actor. He said, this is Mark Headley. So anyway, John Huston puts his hand out and I'm shaking his hand, looking up at him. And I'm saying, excuse me, sir, but what do you do? I was that naive back, when I was 19. And he says, well, son, I'm the director. And from that was an inspiration. And I decided, well, I just don't want to be an actor. I want to be a John Huston. So I followed him around the set. Nobody really cared because he was a director. He wasn't a major actor. And, he told me so many stories about African Queen and all the, films that he did. And it was just, and I think that was the point where I realized that if I was going to do it, I would have to commit the rest of my life to do it. I've worked with major celebrities. Zach Galifianakis, I produced a film in Seattle with him. He was great. He was funny. Just a great personality. He's great on film, great as a personality. Mark Ruffalo, back in the day, Near 3, and he was a joy, but he was just starting off in the film industry of 1983 for Hollywood, and stayed there for about 30 years. But I love Tucson, and I've come back and forth, and I've done about 4 feature films here in Tucson, and been able to hire some good people, and there's some great people here, a cast and crew that I still continue to work with. Being in the film industry, it's like riding the waves. Sometimes there's low points, sometimes there's high points, and you just survive the low points, to get back to the high points. Peter with the film Tucson is doing a great job. I've known Peter for over 30 years. We are getting work back here in Arizona. It's starting to pick up once again. Get a camera. So long as you have a camera and people crazy enough to get in front of the camera, you can make a movie. So just go out and make a movie, okay? Documentaries are fun, but we don't make any money doing documentaries. But they're good learning. I've done a number of documentaries myself. So it's a matter of just go out there and do it. Don't be afraid. Get your friends and family involved. Steven Spielberg basically did his films when he was 10 years old in his backyard, and that's, if you have the passion and the interest, don't worry about the money. The money will follow, but just learn the craft, and discover if you're interested in cinematography, wardrobe, makeup, lighting. There's over 100 jobs in the movie industry.